Good morning, good people. Thank you for coming to the workshop, Open GLAM for Critical OER, Free Knowledge Pedagogy for Intercultural Co-Curation. We are honored and delighted to share virtual space with you. Thank you for coming. We have an extraordinary lineup, a veritable meeting of the minds, and I invite you to share your information, questions, leads, links in the chat box. That's a living document for us to have collective space together. So I'll dive in. I'm also co-designed this with my longtime thought partner and very wonderful friend, Virginia Poundstone. And we're working currently on a project with Curationist, MHC Foundation, but have a broader set of collaborations that we are, that culminate in these exact questions. So our lineup for today, our run of the show, I'm going to give a brief overview of critical open educational resources and the urgency. Virginia is going to lead us on a mural warm-up. Evelyn Scan-Heidel is going to be introducing us briefly to the Open GLAM dimension. And then we have two speakers, Ajoa Jones de Almeida, who's Director of Education at the Brooklyn Museum, among many other things, community leader. Namita Gupta-Wiggers is a Critical Craft Forum founder and also director and co-founder of the grad program of Critical Craft at Warren Wilson, among many other things. They both sit at the intersection of frankly, radical education and curation and the power of museums and craft and art to liberate. Then we're going to have a quick poll to get feedback from you all. And then we have lightning cameos from our Curationist graduate fellows, Jing Cui, Andres de los Rios, Francisco Rudolph, Magali Delgado. Oh, forgive the typo, Magali. And then we dive into an empathy mapping activity and discussion, and then report back and begin the process of building community thereafter. So I begin with the museum so all of these young people are online right now. COVID has hit and we're even more online than ever. And there's a treasury of gems online through the digital dimension of museums. And you all know that better than anyone in the world. This is your world. And so we here are thinking about these gems that are online. How can young people and adult learners and lifelong learners learn from them, not just the objects, but also how those objects came to be in those museums and affiliated with the museums? So we're thinking about things like the Rosetta Stone as a digital object, telling the story of analog empire, as well as broader understandings of translation and transporting and meaning making. Many of you all might have seen the Ignite talk from last week about the quipu. Here's our quipu again. So another set of objects that have long analog ancient histories and now are in the digital domain, and how can young people learn from them? An example is this particular jar, which has the quipu design on it, you can see. It's called an urpu in Quechua. It's an ancient Incan jar. The metadata on the object calls it an aribayo, which is actually a Greek word, and the Met actually describes it. They say that this aribayo, we call it that because of its similarity to the Greek form, which is a perfume bottle, not a jar for holding chicha, corn beer, and maize seed. So thinking about how is the metadata encompassing not just the knowledge about the object, but a Eurocentric understanding of cultural reference at large. Many people are already thinking about metadata as a site of thinking about the context of digital art and cultural objects. So we're following the lead of the traditional knowledge label folk, as well as others. So we open up the floor today thinking about what knowledge does a digital cultural heritage object hold, and what knowledge does its metadata hold, and who even writes that? And from a pedagogical standpoint in particular, how do diverse learners seek and find knowledge encompassed in digital heritage objects? And how, if so, how do they encounter metadata, if they even do? And who wants to help layer, tag, thread, and weave this metadata and other radical feminist metaphors for layering knowledge? So this workshop is an attempt to connect, to build communities of practice. So please drop links and leads and ideas in the chat box, and we will save the chat and distribute it later so as to keep building connections. So here we go. Virginia.
Garrett, I need you to stop screen sharing so I'll be able to. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start us off. We're going to build some collaborative tool muscles with a quick little warm up here. And are you all able to see a screen that says, how are you? Give me a thumbs up. Yes? Okay, great. So we're going to do a quick little warm up on the collaboration whiteboard tool that we'll be using later on in the session as we break out. There can be a little bit of a learning curve to it, so I wanted to take a minute to let people get loose in it and try it out. I'm going to drop a link. Let me copy it quickly. And now that I'm presenting, I actually can't see the chat. Sorry, let's see if I can figure out the chat.
I dropped it for you already, Virginia, no worries.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Scan. Okay, so you should, as a viewer, you can go ahead and start to enter in, but I'm just going to do a quick tour of this tool. Look down at the bottom right corner is a navigation tool, and this is where you will be able to see where you are on the board. You can zoom in and you can zoom all the way out if you get all the way lost. So this is all the zoom settings. The other really handy thing is you can click the hand and you can grab and move around on the board. So you can always find yourself. You need to unclick it in order to return to a normal spot. So then you go up here to this little square box with a tab on it, and you can open it up and you can grab a sticky note. You click on it and then you can enter some text. And you can let us know how you're doing today. You move them around by clicking on them and dragging and dropping. You can make them bigger. You can make them smaller. And now that you've done one, you can double click somewhere else on the board and a new box will open up. It's so exciting to see everybody in there working simultaneously. It's like a whole little flurry. So busy and caffeinated. I love that. A bit tired from sitting all day. Oh, I feel that so much. If you can stand up and work, do that. If you can, as you listen to our wonderful presentations, you can maybe take a standing break instead of sitting, if that's an option. Let me zoom in so I can actually see everybody. Tired. I see a lot of tired, a little nervous. Oh, don't worry. We will all be friends. We are all friends. This is a friendly, encouraging environment. Excited, cold. Oh no, you need a blanket. Tired, but happy to be in this session. Great. Nice smiley face. All right. Welcome to this session. And you can keep playing around in this tool as you want to get more comfortable. And we will see you again in Mural a little later on in this session. Garrett?
Yeah, great, Scan. I think if you want to point us to a few of your projects, particularly the declaration.
Yes, I'm so sorry. My my connection for some reason broke, but I'm guessing that you were talking to me, right?
If you wanted to point us to the declaration, that'll help us orient the OER with the Open GLAM as we dive into a JOA.
Yeah, so I'm gonna share the link. It's openglam.papad.org. And that's basically a research paper that is supporting and informing what we expect is gonna be a declaration on open access to cultural heritage. And what we're doing there is sort of exploring some important questions on digital reproductions of artworks and other type of media, and how that also relates to some other considerations that need to be taken into account when doing open access. So that's basically like a good resource. If you're familiar to some of these things, you're going to see a lot of evidence collected there. If you are new to these things, then it's going to be like a great resource for you to dive into and learn more about this thing that we call Open GLAM, or open access to cultural heritage.
That's great. And if anyone has questions, Scan is the expert on this interface, so we're honored to have her with us. And now we pass the mic to Ajoa Jones de Almeida.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this all goes smoothly. And now, of course, I can't see you. I can see some of you. Oh, okay, I can see some folks up here. Let me know. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, so I'm going to start off just with land and ancestral acknowledgement. We're all disembodied right now in the virtual realm, but we actually are physically standing on land wherever we might be. So I am here, I live in Brooklyn and work at the Brooklyn Museum, and Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Museum stands on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. As a sign of respect, we recognize and honor the Lenape Delaware nations, their elders past and present, and future generations. We're committed to addressing exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and confronting the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in our work. I invite us to take a minute to silently acknowledge this and other communities, peoples, ancestors whose shoulders we stand on. And I'll just also share that if you are not sure about the land that you stand on and the peoples whose legacies that land is founded on, I just dropped into a chat a link that you can use to look up to see who the various Indigenous First Peoples were and are in relationship to your physical location. Thank you. So over the past few years, the education team at the Brooklyn Museum has been building a collective vision for how we understand our work. These are some of the goals and strategies that we feel define our pedagogical approach to arts education. So we activate the museum as a participatory space where visitors create meaning through creative expression, critical dialogue, wonder, and joy. We nurture dialogue across multiple perspectives in order to shift dominant narratives and to center historically marginalized voices. And here there's some further bullets that kind of map out a little bit how we approach our work. We employ a social justice-oriented, anti-racist, and culturally responsive approach. We uplift multiple perspectives and ways of knowing. We engage visitors' multiple intelligences, and we strengthen creativity through visitor-centered approaches, including what some of you might be familiar with, visual thinking strategies known as VTS, guided questioning, close looking, etc. So I actually want to zoom in on one of the principles, one of the kind of framing principles for our approach. Let me see. Which is the one highlighted in red above, which says, we employ a social justice-oriented, anti-racist, culturally responsive pedagogy that centers the strength, wisdom, and resilience of diverse communities. Over the past couple of years, and especially this year, the Education Division has been engaged in really trying to understand what we mean by this. And I'd like to share with you all today some of the reflections that we've been grappling with as we delve into these ideas. So it's useful to break down some of these terms to their key underlying components. And when we're delving into these ideas of social justice, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, the idea of oppression itself, really what we're talking about is power. And so I'd like to take a minute to really explore, as we've been exploring in the Education Division at BKM, the relationship between our education and concepts of power. Part of our reflection has been around understanding this relationship. And this is actually a conversation which has long roots at the Brooklyn Museum. Booker T. Washington in 1896 actually made an address at the Brooklyn Museum, then known as the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. And in that address, he said, many things, one of which were the study of art that does not result in making the strong less willing to oppress the weak means little. And Washington's ideas, which around basically what today we might term art as a vehicle for social justice, were no doubt informed and inspired by Frederick Douglass and his framework for understanding power. And Washington actually wrote Frederick Douglass's biography, which he published in 1899. And Douglass, of course, famously said around this notion of power that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. It may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. So Washington, in his statement, is inferring that in order for the study of art to make the strong less willing to oppress the weak, it must involve struggle. For arts educators, the context for this struggle is often in the realm of uncomfortable conversations that can arise when we facilitate open-ended conversations with a piece of art, either in person in galleries or currently virtually in the virtual realm. And rather than shying away from these difficult or tense encounters, we really are asked to push ourselves and the audiences with whom we engage to investigate the contours of our discomfort, always remembering to do so with empathy. This is the challenge and the call. But we also can't ignore the history of the institutions who have collected all of these objects over hundreds of years. The Brooklyn Museum evolved as a typical museum of its time with encyclopedic ambitions, fueled and funded by the wealth amassed during this country's Gilded Age of robber barons. It is one of the oldest and largest museums in the United States, with roots dating back to 1823, and with collections from across the globe encompassing around 1.5 million works. So after closing our doors in March 2020 and buckling down to an intensive period of internal reckoning around issues of social justice, racial injustice, systemic inequities, and the ongoing legacy of white supremacy in the Brooklyn Museum and across other museums, we began an internal dialogue within the education division around this idea of death to museums. This term, death to museums, was the title of a 2019 edition of Forward Museums, a journal produced by students and faculties at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And from there, it's become now the title of a monthly dialogue series that promotes solidarity and exchange among museum workers through wide-ranging workshops, presentations, etc. And we as a division actually had the opportunity to listen together and to dialogue around a presentation from Dr. Portia A. Moore, who some of you may be familiar with. And her presentation focused on this idea of today is a good day for museums to die. So during our October retreat at the Education Division, we actually then, after dialoguing and reflecting on her presentation, we spent some time doing what we do best, looking at images together. And we actually opened up our retreat looking at these 3 images from the tarot, from different lineages of the tarot. And we VTS'd it together. So starting off with, what's going on in this image or in these images? What else can we find? What do you see that makes you say that? And part of what emerged, I wish if we had time, I would love to actually delve into this together with you all, but I only have 15 minutes and I have a lot more to say to you all. So please, but do, while I'm talking, take a look and see what comes up for you across these 3 images. Part of what emerged for us collectively was this reflection on the critical importance of death in this moment for the field. And in particular, the idea that ashes are necessary and required as a catalyst for rebirth. So we began to use this as an inspiration to begin the work of taking stock of the museum teaching practices and approaches that we are committed to letting die. But not just to die for the sake of dying, but we're committed to letting them die because we understand that this is critical in order to make space for the practices, histories, and epistemologies or ways of knowing that inspire us and that nurture our yearning and our commitment to liberation. So for me, that has meant looking back to the social movements that have informed my own specific crossroads of identities as an African American with Southern roots and as a Brazilian with rural roots, and to reflect and learn from the strategies developed by popular education movements across both of these contexts. In my 20s, I became involved with a collective of women of color in Brooklyn who were deeply inspired by the freedom schools developed during the civil rights movement in this country, and by the writings of women of color reflecting on these histories. We developed what we call, we were known as Sister to Sister, and we developed what we call the Freedom School for Young Women of Color, which encompassed political education, youth organizing, creative and artistic expression as strategies for personal and collective transformation. Working with this collective for 10 years has been instrumental for my work at the Brooklyn Museum in terms of understanding how critical it is to lift up the voices, histories, and ways of knowing from diverse BIPOC communities, and especially women, LGBTQ+, and youth voices in those communities, in order to give us the tools that we need to imagine a more liberatory path forward. One of the books that most impacted my thinking around these ideas is Paulo Freire, the Brazilian adult educator, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The first time that I read it, I was both inspired, but also deeply irritated by his approach. Inspired because for him, the educator, or what he calls the facilitator, is the ultimate revolutionary, but irritated because his language continuously betrays a monolithic and often patriarchal understanding of the oppressed. That being the case, in any case though, I continue to find deeply inspiring the fact that for him, the true educator or facilitator must be driven by faith. He's also coming from the liberation theology. So this idea of an absolute faith in each human being's ability to critically see and interpret the world around them, which will necessarily lead them to liberation, whatever that may look like for them, as long as they're given the opportunity to critically examine their lived experiences. So equally inspiring for me and for us and others in this work were the voices of scholars, artists, and poets like Audre Lorde, who in the 1970s and 80s began to bring to light the need for an intersectional approach to knowledge for dismantling oppression. Through their contributions, we can no longer define the oppressed in overly simplistic terms as if the life experiences of all marginalized and oppressed people were interchangeable. So the very notion of social justice becomes an active endeavor that requires constant vigilance, critical reflection of the world around us, balanced with self-reflection and humility. So this is an example, based on these reflections, this is an example of the work that we've been engaged in education. So literally, this was just a little snippet of the document. It's a long document where we've been taking stock of the modes of interactions with content, with audiences, and with the institution that for us are examples of ongoing oppression. And then the next piece of it is replacing and reimagining these kinds of interactions driven by a more liberatory approach. As the pandemic now has confined our interactions with audiences and communities to the virtual realm, we have also begun to critically examine how different program formats, platforms, and digital content can either reinforce or interrupt oppression. Part of the critical work ahead is to understand how systemic racial inequities are being reproduced and reinforced in formal K-12 online learning currently, and in informal virtual programming, in order to develop strategies for infusing a popular education or liberatory approach instead. So I'm just going to close with this wonderful quote that I love from Robin Kelley, Freedom Dreams. He says, "We must tap the well of our own collective imaginations, do what earlier generations have done, dream, trying to envision somewhere in advance of nowhere, as poet Jane Cortez puts it, is an extremely difficult task, yet it is a matter of great urgency. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down." As arts institution educators, artists, it feels appropriate that we be asked to activate our imaginations to reimagine the role of museums in people's lives. It is about letting go of ways of being that no longer serve us, and also about activating our ability to birth new possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Majoa. That was brilliant. We need hours on this. So pass the mic quickly to Namita as we ponder all of those wisdoms.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ajoa. I mean, we didn't coordinate this ahead of time, but it's absolutely wonderful the way it's going to work together. So I'm super, super excited. I want to pick up on, first of all, recognizing where I'm coming from. I am standing on what is now known as Portland, which is the home to many, many, many Native communities. It's the 9th largest population of Indigenous communities in an urban center in the United States. And if you all have a moment, I strongly encourage you to take a look at what's going on with the Native Arts and Culture Center Foundation, excuse me, and the YU Contemporary here in Portland. YU has given over their space and their land to the Native Art and Culture Foundation. It's a small act of reparation, a big act in dollars, but and a huge act in terms of making sure that that contemporary Native communities have a space and that we have a location to celebrate the people who have tended to the land that we are guests on, or I should say settlers on. Guests isn't the word we like to use these days, but I'm speaking fast to try to get everything through, so I apologize for saying guests. But we are all settlers here. I am an immigrant. I was born in the United States, so I come to you as an immigrant and a settler from here in Portland, Oregon. What I'm going to do is actually pick up where Ajoa has taken us in terms of understanding some of the kinds of change that needs to happen, and to talk to you a lot about some of the workarounds that have been happening in other ways in the craftscape, what I call the craftscape. And this is a way to help you also think about the ways that museums and the structures in museums don't allow for people to be represented or self-representation. And so people have turned to other kinds of platforms, specifically social media, and other types of things to find ways to circumvent gatekeeping and be able to represent themselves and speak for themselves, not to be spoken for. And as I load up the screen, I will share that I am going to be giving you a whole lot of resources at the end. And I'm going to just put them all in the chat. So it will be a way, whoops, it will be a way for you to get the information at that point. So sorry, y'all, hold on one second. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. And of course, it's going to give me trouble right now. Sorry about this. Am I still online? Hello?
Yes, you're here. We didn't.
Yes, I'm so sorry. It's gone all dodgy on me.
Trouble sharing screen.
Yeah, it's not sharing. It's, sorry, hold on one second.
No problem.
I apologize.
Oh, there it is. Yay.
All right. So let me go back to the presentation. We tested this, and of course, when you test it, it never does it exactly right when you get online. Are you all seeing my presenter view or the presentation?
Presenter view.
Okay, how about now?
Presentation.
Okay, great. All right. So we're going to start by talking about a couple of these ways in which that communities have been building as models. And I think some of you may be familiar with things like Ravelry, which is an online space for knitters. Hundreds of thousands of people are engaged here. It's a great example of what Abigail DeKosnik talks about as rogue archives, as these spaces in which the internet and social media allow other kinds of archives to be built. The tricky thing about these kinds of archives, as we know, is that they are precarious. They are run by volunteers. They are not necessarily following the quote unquote standards that we have set up in museums, which is problematic in so many ways, partly because of what it reinscribes, but also partly problematic because it means that when volunteer labor disappears, many of these kinds of archives may disappear as well. I'm also interested in the way in which a certain generation of particularly women have come into view through social media and through the internet. And I'm thinking specifically about people who are involved in Handmade Nation, which some of you may know as Faith Levine's project. And Lisa Congdon is a great example of someone who was working in one kind of field and through the internet was able to build a following and now is working full-time as an artist and an illustrator. And Kate Bingaman-Burt, who is a faculty member at Portland State University, is another great example of someone who started using Flickr as a place to start posting images of her work. Her work skyrocketed, and now she speaks at dozens and dozens of conferences. Some of you may know her work, and she teaches at Portland State. These are two examples of women who basically used social media and used these different platforms that are workarounds in order to build an audience and create a space for craft. And they are now, I would say this has been going on, given their ages, almost about 15 to 20 years ago that this all has been taking place. It also is happening through Instagram. And this is a project by Ayumi Harie. It's called Pots in Action. And basically what this did is it was a 5-year project, and every week there would be a different theme, and then Ayumi would put a hashtag for the theme. So it might be PIA education or PIA wood-fired, and anybody who put that hashtag on their image would get tagged. And so Instagram, working the way that it's supposed to, would allow for hundreds and thousands of people to tag their images and all come together. And what happened is the way in which it functioned is that it just basically built an opportunity for the clay community around the globe, mostly in Northern Hemisphere spaces, I would say, but allowed for anyone who had internet access and could upload the images to be able to join in and include their images in this project. The problem is that right now, the image, the result is an image like this. It's basically the Instagram feed, and the project has ended, but the dynamism of the way that the internet works and the way Instagram works doesn't show itself in this Instagram feed or on the website. And now Ayumi is raising money to build a website to track and document the work that she had done. But I highly recommend you take a look at the work that she was doing here. I also want to bring your attention to Tiffany Moman's blackcraftspeople.org. Tiffany found that there was a museum, she was doing research on Southern decorative arts, specifically on African-American representation in Southern decorative arts. There was a museum that has 90,000 objects. Out of those 90,000 objects, 6,000 are specified as being made by free or formerly enslaved African Americans. Out of that, only 60 or 70 are identified as being made by females. So there's a whole lot of layers of problems going on in the database, in how it's being tagged, and who is being represented in that. What she has done is a really interesting way of tracking through looking at announcements in newspapers, advertisements that talk about purchasing bodies, or advertisements that are about people who have run away and are trying to seek freedom. She has found a way to use those advertisements to identify places where there were craftspeople, blacksmiths, weavers, etc., carpenters, and is using a map to track where that location is. So it's a way to, again, circumvent these archives that are object-centric and are built in a certain way for museums, because that's the work that we do. And I should say, I've worked most of my professional life in museums, so I understand the structures and systems, but I'm really excited about the way that something like this takes material culture, it takes ways of working, and flips it into another way. I've experimented when I was the curator and director at Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, and I think I wanted to bring this in because I really think it's important to have examples of small museums outside of the major cities in the United States. We were a small museum. We had about our average attendance was about 30 to 40,000 a year. It was about 3,000 square feet. This particular project was allowed people to borrow bowls and send pictures in, and then there's a Tumblr blog where everybody's stories and pictures were placed on there. And it gave a chance for the community, specifically children, that was the exciting thing for me, for children to be able to share their stories about how they tended to, cared for, and interacted with the bowls. And it gave a sense of ownership of the space, of the objects, and of the museum as a cultural center in Portland. We also did other projects where we went through and systematically took weaving drafts from one artist and turned them into digital drafts, which are then available. They were available in the exhibition and on the website, where artists who were resident artists could come in and use the same drafts to create work, as well as when we put them online, other people could access them and put up their Flickr images of the kinds of things that they did with the exact same weaving drafts that were on view at the museum. So again, trying to use these workarounds to bring in community. We also did an exhibition called Touching Warms the Art, which was an interactive contemporary art jewelry exhibition. And there is an archive of some 1,600 images of people trying jewelry on. So it allowed for the artists who are from 67 countries to see how people engage their work, but then also to allow people to use these sort of as a quick snapshot of their experience from a particular day. So the last thing I wanted to touch on are a couple of things. You know, when we look at things like a tombstone label, I'm really struck by how a tombstone label reads like the entry in an encyclopedia. And basically, when you start looking at something like cotton listed in the encyclopedia is listed as a material. It's something that's extracted or cultivated or harvested from the earth. And then cotton is listed potentially in the tombstone label in a museum as well. And there, cotton has a very, very different meaning. It's about a woven textile. It's in a different form. We don't make these distinctions, but then when you look at these, and these are things that many of you know, but it just has struck me recently how much this speaks to our lack of understanding of where materials come from and the lack of understanding about the structures that are in place in our online databases that are invisible to students. And my students are older. The average age of my students is 39. But when I try to talk to them about the different ways in which the internet is reinscribing or restructuring some of the enlightenment-based categories of how we understand material and matter as being something separate from humans, and humans also being hierarchized as well, of course, they don't see it. And it's because there are things like this that are so deeply ingrained in how we structure our information that still that disallow for us to do the workarounds, which ties back in, and I'll just conclude with this, but it ties back in with what Ajoa was pointing out, that we have got to stop and rethink how we are conveying information, what information we need to share, and figure out how to have different voices in the process if we are going to actually make changes to not just reinscribing and transferring over certain structures right into the internet and the way that we continue to put forth museums and collections in this space. Thank you. I'm going to put my chat all the references in the chat for y'all.
Thank you, Namita.
That was incredible, Namita and Ajwa. I feel really full and really, really inspired and challenged in all of the right ways. Thank you so much for both of your presentations. I just dropped, and it might be hard to find, so Scan's also going to drop a link to menti.com. It's not a link, actually. We're going to do a quick little poll to start to get our minds thinking about how we are going to work with the information, the incredible information we just received, and how we're going to position ourselves within it. So we're going to start to get a little bit embodied. So Menti, if you go to menti.com on your browser and there's a passcode there, you will be presented with a question. And thank you, Evelyn put in the direct link as well. The question is, who do you serve as an educator? And please check all that apply. I'm going to share my screen and you will start to see the results coming in from what everyone says. So as people enter their results, we can in real time see who people are working with directly. And if you yourself if you do not consider yourself to be an educator, what kind of learner are you? That's the other way you can approach this question. So it looks like we have a really nice, even mix here, actually. Which sort of signals to me that most people work with most of these people. Most of these types of learners. So this is a great segue to our learners that Garrett has been working with here at Curationist as we are testing out our fellows, developing our fellows program. So I will you can continue to answer this question through Menti as Garrett introduces our fellows, and you'll see me again in a little bit.
Yeah, I think we'll go now to Jing, and she's we're just doing a 3-minute segment. She'll pass the mic to Andres, pass the mic to Francisca, and Francisco will pass the mic to Magali.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jane. I'm a museum publisher. I graduated from U of T Museum Study program last year. I'm also a researcher of Asia-Pacific War. Today, I'm going to share my knowledge about the virtual offerings of Chinese museums. I'm going to share my screen now. Hope it works. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm trying to do it in 3 minutes, which is quite impossible, but let me try. Okay, first, a glance of Chinese museums. There are more than 5,000 museums, registered museums in China by 2019, and you can see there's a boom during the past 10 years. In 2019, Chinese museums received over 1 billion visitors. That can be explained by their free admission policy. About 90% of those museums offer free admission, and about 70% of the museums are state-owned, so they have their funding from the state, which enables them to offer free admission. Okay, now about the virtual offering of Chinese museums. This is happening now, because China started the pandemic started in China late 2019. So the Chinese museum reacted really quickly. By July 2020. They launched more than 2,000 online exhibitions and received 5 billion page views during the pandemic. And the administration launched a one-stop platform where the audience can get access to all those online exhibitions. They could choose, they could filter the exhibition by provinces, by theme, by category and date. I'm going to share with you a few typical virtual offerings, my tabs for virtual offerings later. Yeah. One of the most popular online exhibitions that offer is themed exhibition. What you're looking here is offered by the Forbidden City. What they did is to select objects from their huge collection. Mind you, this is the royal collection of China. Those objects are one way or another related to the celebration of a Spring Festival. So here, what you really learn is not only about those objects, but also how people celebrated Spring Festival, the Chinese New Year, in ancient times, especially in the palaces by the royal families. And next, they also have virtual tours. This is especially appealing one. It is a side museum, like this one. You could choose where to go, and you could actually go into the caves to see the murals, to see the sculptures. And the third type is very straightforward. A lot of the museums share their archives. Digital archives with basically tombstone information about the objects. And the final type, the final category is this is a physical exhibition turned into an online exhibition. It's quite similar to what Google Arts have been offering. You could actually go into their gallery, you could walk around, and if you click on the objects, it pops up with the information of background about the project. Because I have been working with Chinese museums for over 15 years, we published their catalogs, their souvenir guides. I worked with about 15 major museums in China, so I can see how this virtual offering can break down the walls of those museums and bring their collection, their space to a much wider audience. So that's my presentation. I hope I didn't go over time, and thank you. Stop share.
Hi, well, thank you, Ying, first and foremost, for that very insightful presentation. Very difficult to follow up to, but I will definitely try my best. Hi, everyone. My name is Andres de los Rios. As Ying, I'm also a recent graduate student from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. I graduated, though, with a dual master's, both in information systems design as well as museum studies, because I'm fascinated by the potential of democratically created systems, regardless of the field, but particularly in our GLAM sector. That's where I met Curationists. So with them, I coordinated a series of fascinating interviews that will soon be published as features on Curationist websites with thought leaders that are currently working on bringing out their projects for decolonized digital cultural heritage. So we spoke with thought leaders like Stacey Allison Kazin from the University of York, who are thinking about using tools like Wikidata or Wikimedia to bring the control over digital assets of indigenous communities to the actual source communities, make them part of the creation of these new systems. At the same time, I worked, we interviewed members of the Palacio Canton, so a regional museum in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where I come from, to also get a better idea of, well, what are the socioeconomic challenges and realities that are blocking the presentation of their regional, again, assets and cultural heritage to a broader base through online means. For my own professional track, I also focus and I'm fascinated by the concept of ethical AI. Like open digital collections, I think it's a field that requires, or now is finally asking the question of who gets to be in the discussion table to create solutions that actually cater everyone's needs, to bring in the users to the conversation, as opposed to just having technology for technology's sake. So from focusing on this path, I was able to work with the Digital Creation Institute, also at the University of Toronto, where we're coming up with new methodologies or new ways to design systems such that we have everyone's voice on the table. So we're using things such as soft-system methodology, user-centered design methodologies like empathy mapping, like we're going to use later today, to actually ask, well, what is this? Who is this system meant to service, and how we can ensure that from the beginning the system is ethically based and it's not something that is just a matter of checklisting at the end or once it is in use. And finally, another project that I'm very excited about, but it's in the process of being authored. Me and some colleagues from the University of Toronto are working on a literature review of AI strategies and guidelines from around the world in order to, sorry, that's my cue for 3 minutes. I'm about to wrap up, but we're basically conducting a literature review to understand, well, what are the trends, most common trends in terms of fair, sustainable, transparent AI principles, but not so much for the systems, but for the socioeconomic impact that they have. So let's think about AI ethically, but not just, so the system itself is ethically, but the system in sense of the users and how it affects them. So that's me, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the next stage of this workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. Francisca.
Thanks, Andres. That was really interesting. We should talk in time. Okay, 3 minutes on the clock. Here we go. My name is Francisca. Hi, everyone. I am a graduate student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I am working on a dual master's program in art history and arts administration and policy. My work focuses on the dissemination of art historical information online. I do a lot of research on the digital methods used by cultural institutions to accommodate their repositories, to reflect accessible content with various perspectives and decentralized art historical canons that ultimately elevate decolonial narratives. I think a lot about the ethical challenges that come with sharing openly. I think mass digitization is a fascinating phenomenon of our time. In college, I majored in art history and mathematics, and I'm always trying to put that math degree to good use. So I believe in the ability of pure mathematical logic to help us explore the invisible systems, the ways in which we communicate in this digital age, and make visible the big picture behind the algorithms that construct our everyday networks and the ways we share information with each other. The book Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble is a great example of how the systems we've created propagate things like racism. So my research revolves around this idea of digital colonialism, the idea that data is colonized, the digital cultural record is colonized, that the use of digital technologies like 3D printing and scanning can be ways of colonizing cultural sites and artifacts. So I really do praise projects like Curationists for working towards fixing these problems that things that Google Arts and Culture, for example, are creating for cultural heritage. And I'm definitely on board with trying to collectively write history, multiple histories, as opposed to just reproducing what we see on textbooks. And here I'm mostly thinking about young art history students. I see so many at my school struggling to write in this art speak, And I think about some of the papers that I wrote in undergrad and I cringe because I learned all these messed up ideals about what the profession should look like. I also think a lot about ownership and what that means. So in terms of thinking about things like claiming patrimony, when we talk about repatriation, who gets to decide what's shown, what gets digitized, what gets given to someone else, what metadata is attached to it. The various forms of acknowledgement for looted colonial objects, for example, is on a spectrum. And I'm also wondering if anyone here knows the difference between repatriation and restitution of cultural heritage and their different implications when it comes to like this conversation of acknowledging the past. Because I've been trying to figure that out. And okay, I'm almost done. I think about ownership also specifically in its impact to new media art, because new media art is a network-based art, because of the mass production that comes along with digitization. A lot of new media art embraces the changing state of artistic originality, things like appropriation, remix, open sharing, things that blur the boundaries of ownership. And I think these artists are truly visionaries. I mean, what will they do with open access to something like the Art Institute of Chicago's public API? So I love working with them directly. I curated a show last year called Fix It Equals Death. I'll drop a link in the chat. But yeah, if you want to talk about new media art, that's what my thesis is all about. So I'd be happy to chat about it.
Thanks, Francisca. Magali.
Let me start my timer. Hi, everyone. My name is Magali Delgado. I'm a master's student at U of T of the program of Museum Studies. And well, I haven't have a lot of experience working in organizations, but I'm trying to figure out my path as a museum professional for the future. And while exploring all my options during the master's program, I became very inspired by a volunteer position that I took for the SOS Association of the Windsor University students. It's students offering support. And they have this amazing project of scientific workshops that are delivered to indigenous communities in Guatemala. So my participation there is only as a translator of the workshops, right? So I am the link between the Canadian students and the Guatemalan students that are sharing scientific knowledge. So that brought me to think that maybe I want to focus on working on developed systems that allow Canadian or North American cultural institutions to connect with the institutions in these communities, in these countries that they do have the root knowledge that all of us are looking for. You know, like sometimes this decolonization process in my head is so hard to implement because we don't really get the roots of where all these pieces or all these art, all of the museum collections are coming from. So I've been thinking about what if we link together communities with communities, right? Like people of color, not only from North America, but what about all the people of color communities in South America and Central America? They have a lot to say and we have a lot to learn from them, but the bridge is broken just now, right? It's everything that we can learn from them, but what about what they can learn from us? And if we bring this content directly to them, what can we get from them? From my experiences in these workshops, I've noticed that Canadian students are amazed by everything that they have learned from the students in Guatemala, right? So this position of power where they share knowledge about science, it's balanced when they are amazed by the culture of these people and their hearts and their willingness to share what they are proud of their culture and the efforts that they make to participate in these workshops. So I'm thinking if we move that perspective, not only for these students that want to make change, but also for big institutions when they see how culture and how art can make an impact and the meaning that it has for communities directly. So my idea is to try to work on developing a model that could improve interinstitutional collaboration between North American and South and Central American institutions to enhance this, to improve this communication. Thank you.
Seeds of future collaboration, everyone. We're witnessing it here. Thank you, Magali. I pass the mic to Virginia to start us on the empathy mapping activity.
Remind me, we're done at 1, right? Okay, so we're gonna do this pretty quickly. I'm gonna actually, before we start mapping, I'm gonna send you back to menti.com. And I have one more question for you there to get us going. So menti.com, if somebody can drop that in the chat for me, menti.com, and the code is 6584757, and I will share my screen so you can all see that. So if you can go in and I want you to start to think about, this is all fast. We're getting lots of information and now we're going to workshop and we only have 30 minutes. So we're going quickly. So I want to just take a minute to think. And I want us to focus on, what does it mean to empathize and how do we empathize so we can get in the right mindset for the workshop. Care and justice, to feel what someone else is feeling, listening, humility, to remember, oh, that's interesting, to remember, listening, to honor, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You empathize by listening and trying to understand, compassion, connect with and understand another's perspective, to fully and openly listen and hear and relate, decentralizing our egos, that's a very good one. Get out of our own way. Consciousness, listen actively, listen deep, listen constantly, listen and remember. Listening and working to understand what another is feeling. Patience. Understand that dialogue is an exchange, not a conversation. Interesting, yeah, it's definitely an exchange. And there is a lot of conversation required in order to properly be able to walk in someone else's shoes. Stop the diversity and equity written on Google Doc and act and fund and support the diversity and equity, putting the money where the mouth is. Humility, decenter self, being critical of your own perspectives, recognizing our privilege. Encounter, I think that's probably from Garrett. Is that true? The encounter. To devote our full attention, and quid pro, to listen, to care, accept others' lived experiences, might be completely different to your own, but are just as valid. To see, to be with. To think and act from your heart and mind about how others think and act with the intent to connect and to understand, or at least to try to. That's great. So I'm now going to switch gears and we're going to start our empathy mapping project. So if you can drop the empathy map link, it's a separate mural board in the chat. So again, remember, if you get lost in here, you can always come down to the navigation window and find your way. But this is when we should be sent into breakout rooms. But before we do that, I'm just going to say there are 3 things that we're going to be doing. We're going to use sticky notes to brainstorm what our learner thinks, says, and feels and does. And then we're going to organize those notes into pains and gains. Each group is going to have either Garrett, myself, or one of the fellows. And the scenario that we're thinking about is the learner seeks information about a digital object from a museum collection.